Good evening and welcome to the Humanities in Class webinar series hosted and organized by the National Humanities Center. Our session tonight is titled Confederate Monuments and Contested Civic Land Space in the United States, 1865 to the 21st Century. And we'll be joined by Professor Fitzhugh Brundage from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, as well as Kevin Levin, a very experienced educator and Civil War historian who will offer his own reflections about how to translate much of what we'll share tonight into practice and into your classroom. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President of Education at the National Humanities Center. I'm joining you tonight from my home in Chapel Hill, and I'm very pleased that each of you have chosen to spend your evening with us. Some of you on the West Coast are probably just coming out of class. Others in the Midwest and East Coast are probably home tonight, but I hope you've had a good school day. I hope it's been a safe school day. We're excited to be able to share tonight's work with you. You are part of a growing community, though, of humanities educators, and I'd encourage you to keep in touch with me and with the center. I've added my email address and my Twitter handle here. I know the center itself tries to use social media quite a bit. I know Kevin uses social media a lot, so please extend this conversation beyond the 90 minutes or so we have with you. Tonight's webinar will be a conversation, really, between scholars and teachers, between educators and experts in the field. The session will be an audio-based only webinar with an associated PowerPoint, of which you will have access to when we're finished. My job as the moderator is to mine the most important part of this whole thing, which is the chat box. We're going to ask each of you to say hi, greet yourself, let us know where you're from, say hi to your neighbors, but also to register any thoughts, any questions, any resources or URLs that you think are relevant and applicable. I'm going to ask either Fitz or Kevin, whoever's not doing the primary speaking, to also be there with you and chime in and answer your questions. And my job will be to pull out some of those key questions and insert them into the webinar itself. So if you ask something and the conversation is just going quickly and it scrolls up and out of view, please don't hesitate to either ping me privately or to ask the question again, raise your hand again, and I'll be happy to make sure that we address as many of those questions as we can. Really, I think in many ways the webinar, as I've just outlined, it summarizes how the National Humanities Center attempts to contribute to and impact learning. That is, to create bridges, the scholarly world and scholars to the classroom. It's really important to us that we offer a deeper and more complex understanding of these compelling topics, but also to hear and to receive and to integrate the good practice, the good pedagogical approach of working with younger students at the pre-collegiate level, but also at community college and university levels. And the National Humanities Center now for 40 years has attempted to be an advocate for and a leader in that conversation. We do this through a variety of services in our education department that includes a deep repository of free online materials. These instructional resources are intended to be aspirational and exemplars. They're not necessarily lessons to download and implement, although you might. I think they're really an attempt to draw a connection between that scholarly world and the teaching world that I just mentioned. Please visit this. We get about a little over 1 million unique visitors per year, and it's important to us that we share this with as many teachers as we can. Our webinars are also a good opportunity to really spend time lingering on these topics and interacting with the scholars who have done their work and their research in that. While our webinar series is winding to an end, we'll be giving these weekly until mid to late April. We've already begun to plan next year's schedule, and we hope that you and your colleagues will continue to join us. I am hearing from some teachers too, by the way, that while the recordings are helpful, the PowerPoint is helpful for you to take this to your classroom. It also might be appropriate at times to ask your students to join us, and if that's the case, they would sign up just like each of you have in the registration process, or you might have an event or a homework assignment in which they interact with the recording in their own time. A couple of other quick resources and announcements I'd like to make. The first is the rapidly approaching deadline to apply for the 2-week Summer Institute for Teachers that we'll host at the National Humanities Center in July 2018. Titled The Contested Territory, America's Role in Southeast Asia, 1945 to 1975. These 2 weeks will invite 36 teachers from around the country to join us and work face-to-face with just an impressive list of scholars in this field. We'll be working on a lot of innovative emerging technologies, including mobile apps. And if you are interested in applying, the deadline is tomorrow. So please go to the website that's on the screen, complete your cover letter with the NEH, and then submit your full application to me via email. We'll be selecting 36 from our application pool and making announcements by the end of the month, end of March. And this does come with a stipend of $2,100 that will help you come to Durham for 2 weeks and spend time with us. I also want to, if that was closing one activity, I actually want to announce another opportunity to gain instructional resources. One of the things one of our goals really at the National Humanities Center is to make visible the process of working in the humanities. And to those ends, we've just completed and published and are now releasing a digital textbook titled Humanities in Class, A Guide to Thinking and Learning in the Humanities, that aims to really articulate the process of working in 10 different humanities fields. For this work, we assembled 10 scholars and 10 teachers, and we asked them in pairs to create a series of media-based content that talks about the approaches of the field, the ways to think in that field, the questions to ask, the resources that are invaluable, and we've asked them to do so in a way that allows you then to see the work that you do in the through those lenses. The disciplines that we chose to work with are certainly not all of the humanities disciplines, but I hope they find relevance in what you do. They include art history and the classics, environmental humanities, geography, literary studies, musicology, philosophy and ethics, theory, and U.S. and global history. So this free resource is currently in an iBook format. So in order to see the full interactivity, you'll need to have an Apple product. We will be making it available in other ways, which will reduce the functionality a little. But I hope you find from the layout and the way we've designed this that it really does imply a strong interdisciplinary approach to each field, but also really acknowledges the unique disciplinary practice of that field. Currently, this iBook is on iTunes. You can download it for free, and if you do so, I would love to hear how you use it and the kinds of ways that you see it contributing to your own work. Lastly, I'd like to call attention to our Teachers Advisory Council, including Sarah Arnold, who just said hello. This group is really a critical part of the way that we work with teachers and educators at the National Humanities Center. Their contributions and their insights to their classrooms, literally scattered all over the country, really allows us to be as relevant and applicable as we can. So I want to thank them for their service, and also invite any of you not currently in that cohort to consider applying to join it for the 2018-19 school year. We'll be sending out an application process probably in April of 2018. So that's my my introduction for the night. We've got a lot to cover and a lot of deep and thoughtful conversation to have. As all of you know, when you finish tonight's session, you'll receive a link that asks you to do a survey. Once completing that survey, you'll receive another link to download your certificate. There always seems to be a few people the next day who have not received this for some reason, and if that's the case, please reach out to me. Check your spam box first, give it a little bit of time to arrive, and I'll be happy to help you if for some reason that does not come through. So again, thank you for joining us, and you know, for me, this is a particularly relevant and topical topic. I can remember actually reaching out to Fitz Brundage, who is a former fellow at the National Humanities Center last August, right after the events in Charlottesville. Kevin and I actually met in Charlottesville, and we've got a lot of deep connections there, and it was a very first-person event. And while we won't talk necessarily about that tonight, I think this notion of really exploring and understanding the ways in which memory and commemoration and history and culture all get tangled and mingled and misunderstood and manipulated and understood, and a part of the way that we look back, I think, is an important part of what we'll share. Just recently, Matthew Booker, who's an historian at North Carolina State University, led a webinar as a former fellow. He suggested that the past is really a foreign country, that when we go back into it through source work and primary sources, and that we're really interacting with people who have a very different context than the world that we currently inhabit. There's a different language, a different set of social cues, there's different motivations, different interactions. And I wonder sometimes in the last 150, 175 years of American history, if keeping that in mind is an important part of understanding the ways that things develop, the motivations that they are, and maybe gives us permission to not necessarily see it only from our current and contemporary lens. I'm really excited to welcome both Professor Brundage and Kevin to our webinar tonight, and I hope each one of you find ways to not just take the content of tonight's webinar and the literal notion of what it is, but also think about ways that memory and commemoration can be explored in your own communities. And I think by the time we're done tonight, we'll suggest pretty strongly that while we're focusing on Civil War commemoration, this is certainly not something that's applicable just in the South and just in the American South. So Fitz, I'm gonna unmute you here and hand you the microphone, so to speak. Professor Brundage, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Andy. Excuse me, and welcome to everyone. I'm actually joining you all from Lexington, Kentucky, which, as some of you may know, they joke that Kentucky joined the Confederacy after Appomattox. And so it's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm going to go ahead and try to, oh, Andy, you still have the cursor, right?
Well, no, I did give it to you. So if you hover in the lower, yep, there you go.
Yep, I got it. So I want to try to spend some time here explaining some of the impulses, if you will, that explain Confederate memorialization during the late 19th century. And I'll move into the early 20th century in a little bit. But I wanted to start by talking about Confederate defeat. Because typically when we think about the Civil War and the ending of the Civil War, we don't linger that much on the magnitude of Confederate defeat, the scale of the defeat of the South. And so this image is the image that was circulated in the North of the capture of Jefferson Davis in April of 1865. And it was, of course, mocking Jefferson Davis for allegedly fleeing from Union troops in Georgia dressed as a woman. And this is, of course, a northern version of what happened. I don't think Jefferson Davis was ever dressed in an elegant gown like that. If anything, he was wearing a shawl to keep warm. But in any case, it got across the image of a president of the Confederacy being captured in something considerably less than a heroic manner. So it's just one illustration of the, now I can't find the arrow there. Ah, there we go, all the way at the bottom. Sorry about that.
I think you just have to move your mouse around and it will make it pop up.
I'll get better at it, folks. Sorry. So a further example of the scale of the Confederate defeat was, of course, that virtually every major Southern city, or I should say Confederate city, by 1865 had either been captured by the Union Army or had been briefly occupied and destroyed, as in the case of Atlanta, Columbia, South Carolina, and Richmond. So the military defeat of the Confederacy was complete. It was an utter and convincing destruction of the Confederate capacity to fight. And the scale of that was magnified, of course, or I should say the scale of the defeat was captured by the high desertion rate in the Confederacy as well. So that by April of 1865, as you all know, white Southerners in the Confederate Army had been unable to reconcile their commitment to this insurgent nation and their obligation to their families. Now, we also know that the Civil War was by orders of magnitude the bloodiest war in American history. And it's hard to convey just the scale of the human wreckage and death. So this image of this Confederate soldier, this wounded amputee Confederate soldier, is intended to just, if you will, visually convey something of that magnitude. We don't know how many Confederates Confederate soldiers were wounded during the war, but the number may be as many as 200,000. And with this picture in mind, think of the fact that in 1866, the state of Mississippi devoted 1/5 of its state budget to purchasing wooden limbs for former Confederate soldiers. Now, I'll acknowledge that the Mississippi state budget in 1866 wasn't very large, but nevertheless, just imagine 1/5 of a state budget addressed to that need. And we, of course, shouldn't overlook the tens of thousands of Confederates who also spent time in Union prisoner of war camps, so that they were scarred not only physically, but many of them were scarred emotionally. So another simple factoid is that the odds of a soldier in Lee's Army of Northern Virginia surviving the war alive, without serious injury, and without having been captured was about 1 in 5. Now, we don't have any definitive total of the number of Confederates who died during the war. Estimates range from between 250,000 to 300,000. Now, the total number of Confederate forces in the war aren't known because we don't have good Confederate records, but there are estimates between 750,000 and maybe 1.2 million served in the Confederacy. So I mention that because what that means is probably somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 Confederate soldiers died during the war. So there were large numbers of Confederates who were captured and spent time in prisoner of war camps. There were hundreds of thousands who died, and there were hundreds of thousands who were wounded. But let me just linger a little bit further on the number who died. Considerably more than half of the Confederate dead died from disease, not as a consequence necessarily of battlefield wounds. Many of those who died from disease, in other words, died from causes entirely unrelated to combat. So there wasn't anything romantic or heroic necessarily about the death of soldiers who died due to dysentery, diarrhea, and childhood diseases in the camps. So the reason I've lingered on this, the scale of the Confederate defeat, the scale of the human carnage of the war, is because when we think about what white Southerners were doing in the decades after the Civil War, we should remember that they were trying to come to terms with the scale of human suffering and loss they had experienced. So in addition to regaining a place in the Union, replacing slavery with a new system of labor, and rebuilding the Southern economy, white Southerners were trying to figure out how to make sense of a catastrophic war that had achieved none of its purposes. So the impulse of white Southerners to commemorate their sacrifice was inevitable. But how that sacrifice was going to be commemorated was open to various possibilities.
Fitz, just a quick question of clarification from Amelia Philbrook. She asks, do the numbers that you're quoting take into account auxiliary troops like cooks?
That's a good question. One of the challenges with these are all very crude estimates because, as I said, the Confederate records are, well, because the Confederacy collapsed the way it did, the Confederate records were scattered and many of them were lost entirely. So to be honest, I don't really know how fine-grained these estimates are. So that's a very good question of whether this includes literally everyone who might have been affiliated with the Confederate Army or not. I honestly don't know the answer.
Yeah, and as a follow-up question, does that also include deaths that occur after the end of the war, a year or two, even 5 years later, from injuries received in the war?
No, and that's a good question as well, because if you included those, obviously the numbers would be higher. And there's some there are several scholars who have pointed to the the apparent increase in suicide after the Civil War among white Southerners, white Southern men in particular. And they've suggested that some of these suicides may be traced to post-traumatic stress disorder, which of course they didn't know at the time that that condition existed, but also to the lingering effects of battle wounds and other illnesses that were incurable, or the pain was just intolerable. So I think, yes, you could add on to these numbers for the post-war loss as well.
Thank you.
Sure. So let's just, as I mentioned, there were different ways in which white Southerners might have commemorated the war. And so I just want to briefly engage in a kind of thought experiment, a little bit of counterfactual history. So given the magnitude of the Confederate defeat, given that virtually everything that Confederates had fought for was lost by the end of the war, and given the human carnage of the war, we might have expected, or it's conceivable, that white Southerners might have responded to their experience the way some Europeans responded to the carnage of World War I. Might white Southerners have concluded that their failed experiment in nation building had been a singularly bad and regrettable idea? Maybe they would have engaged in some deep introspection about the failings of white Southern civilization that had led them into this disastrous war. And so we might anticipate that they would have erected a commemorative landscape filled with monuments of contrition, regret, or humility, sort of like some of those that, there we go. These examples of World War I monuments in Western Europe that convey obvious sadness and loss. But that's not what white Southerners did. There are very few poignant monuments comparable to these monuments that dot the landscape of especially Western Europe. There are very few Confederate monuments that acknowledge the trauma or waste of war. Instead, what we have is a landscape that I have described as a landscape of sanctimonious defiance, which I think is sort of captured in this Nathan Bedford Forrest monument, and, well, used to stand in a public park in Memphis, Tennessee. So, they didn't create a landscape of loss and of regret. They created a landscape of defiance. So who were these people that started creating this landscape of defiance? Well, the first thing I want to say is that the secessionists, the defenders of secession, aren't that important to our story. And you may be grateful for this, because if you ever read the works written almost immediately after the war by Edward Pollard of Virginia and Alexander Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, you will know that they are dreadfully dull, tendentious, and wholly unconvincing arguments in favor of secession. And they were written after the Civil War had demonstrated that secession was not a viable, real-world solution. The Union Army had pretty clearly demonstrated that secession wasn't a possibility. Jefferson Davis would write his 2-volume defense of secession a little later. These three figures and other ardent defenders of secession really don't play a very important role in the commemoration of the Civil War. They may have been referenced, but they weren't architects of Confederate memory. The honor of being the earliest and among the most influential commemorators of the lost cause goes to Southern white clerics. White clerics vigorously defended slavery before the war, and they championed the Confederate cause during the war. And so they couldn't avoid the obligation to somehow reconcile the war's outcome with God's will. Right? If they had been cheerleading the war, you can imagine that white Southerners would turn to them and say, okay, why did God allow this to happen? White ministers like Father Ryan here and Robert Louis Dabney, they had no doubt that God's hand was evident in the South's defeat. But they urged white Southerners to not abandon their conviction that God favored them or that God had a transcendent purpose for the Confederacy. So it's really quite remarkable, the kind of argument that Father Ryan, Robert Louis Dabney, and others would make. Rather than interpret Appomattox as evidence of God's repudiation of white Southerners and the civilization they had built, Ryan and Dabney and others instead compared white Southerners to the Israelites of the Old Testament. And like the Israelites of the Old Testament, who had to suffer, in part as proof of God's love for them, these clerics argued that God had used the ungodly Yankees to chasten white Southerners who were his chosen people. And Father Ryan and Dabney reaffirmed that if white Southerners submitted to the divine order, they would eventually be delivered. Now, Father Ryan was a Catholic who had been born in Maryland, raised in Missouri. When the Civil War broke out, he left the Vincentian order and became a kind of freelance chaplain, wandering around the Confederacy. After the war was over, he wrote poetry that celebrated the Confederacy. And a few lines of his poetry, I think, will give you an idea of his kind of argument. Quote, "There's grandeur in graves, there's glory in gloom." So yes, there's a kind of, you might go back to my point about contrition. There's no contrition here. Instead, there's a, as I say, a kind of embracing of defeat. He goes on to say, "Each link of the chain that enslaves shall bind us closer to thee." Now think of this. This is a white Southern cleric, Father Ryan, comparing the plight of post-Civil War Confederates to slaves. Each link of the chain that enslaves. The links of the chain that enslave are the Union. And in the act of being bound to the Union, suffering, white Southerners were brought closer to God. A South Carolina Methodist agreed and offered another way of putting it. He said, quote, "To be innocent and to be oppressed are the body and soul of Christianity." So here are clerics saying that to be an oppressed white Southerner is to be closer to God. Now, Robert Louis Dabney offered an even fuller kind of providential interpretation. An interpretation, in other words, in which he could see God's will being worked out. He had no doubt that God had created slavery, had endorsed secession, white supremacy, and that eventually the white South would be vindicated. And he had no doubt that white Southerners had some sort of special destiny in front of them. Another cleric who shared Dabney's perspective on God's intentions saw the war and the defeat as a kind of thrilling prelude to the rise of the white South. Now here's a quote. This is a quote from this cleric in 1869, so 4 years after Appomattox. And this cleric, again, this isn't Dabney, but this is someone influenced by Dabney, proclaims, quote, The war had been a necessary disciplinary ordeal chosen by God to prepare white Southern Christians for their high and holy mission as custodians of unadulterated evangelicalism and as his honored instruments for the development of a pure Christian civilization throughout this continent and throughout Christendom. So think about that. This is 4 years after Appomattox, after this crushing defeat. And here's a white Southern cleric concluding that white Southerners are going to be God's honored instruments to create pure Christian civilization throughout the world. So as I say, these are not people who are chastened by defeat. So I've lingered on these Southern white clerics because they did some enormously important cultural work. First, they made the Confederate cause sacred. Now, and of course, they had tried to do that during the war itself. But after defeat, they continued to argue that the war had been sacred and the Confederate warriors who fought it had been engaged in a sacred struggle. So what these clerics did was they removed any legitimacy, at least in their eyes, to any suggestion that white Southerners who had fought the Civil War had been engaged in an immoral struggle. And the other thing they did was, because they said the war had been part of God's design, and presumably the defeat of the Confederacy had been part of God's design, then they removed from any individual white Southerner the burden for defeat of the Southern Republic. So Southerners, white Southerners, didn't have to carry some sort of guilt that they had gone into this war and lost it badly.
Fitz, let me ask you just a quick question. You know, the way you describe it, and as we look back now and sort of interpret and see the way that this played out, how much of this, in your view, is intentional and scripted and programmatic, and how much of it is just kind of an intuitive way that things occur? I mean, how much of this was on purpose?
Well, I think the clerics were developing these arguments very intentionally. They were working in a kind of theological framework. They believed in providence. They believed that God had a direct hand in human affairs. So they could not escape answering the question of why God had allowed the Confederacy to be defeated. And now the other part of it is there's, of course, I suppose, a very human response, which is to find ways to excuse and justify the experience that white Southerners had had. And so they would, of course, look for something that would, exculpate them. But I think particularly with the clerics, there's a kind of intellectual rigor to this, because, as I said, they had to answer this question precisely because their faith dictated that they do so.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. All right. So the clerics, the big point here is the clerics, in a sense, as I said, made the Confederate cause sacred, and they removed any sort of notion that may have been present. Not that I've seen evidence that there was any, but they removed any stigma of immorality to the Confederate cause. So the next group I want to turn to are Confederate veterans. Their role in shaping Confederate memory started, or I would say became more and more influential during the 1870s, but especially the 1880s and 1890s. Initially, what they wanted was some lifting of the burden of defeat, as you would imagine, and they wanted veneration. They had fought this war and suffered for it. And so they wanted some sort of acknowledgement for their sacrifice. But initially, they were very low-key about expecting that. In the late 1860s and 1870s, various veteran groups began to pop up around the South, but they tended to be very local groups. They were small, they were closely knit organizations that did some memorial work locally, and they did some charitable work locally. So they might erect a monument, a cemetery monument for the commander of a regiment or some military unit in their local community. But they didn't have any sort of region-wide ambition. The first organization that had something close to a region-wide ambition was organized by former Confederate officers in New Orleans in 1869. And it was called the Southern Historical Society. And its goal was to pull together Confederate records, which I mentioned had been scattered hither and yon with the collapse of the Confederacy. So the Southern Historical Society wanted to pull those records together and then begin publishing justifications for the way in which the war had been fought, and to offer explanations, and you might say excuses, for the defeat of the Confederacy. The Southern Historical Society didn't have large numbers of members, and it never had a mass following. But what it did do during the 1870s was to stake out the central ideas of the lost cause, so-called lost cause explanation of Confederate defeat. And the lines of argument that they sketched out during the 1870s were that the Confederacy had, above all, been swamped by the North's industrial superiority and much larger population. In every other regard, they argued, the Confederacy had been superior to the North. They argued its common soldiers were braver and more tenacious than Yankees. Confederate generals were more capable and heroic. And of course, the Confederate cause was more pure and romantic. So the cumulative logic of the interpretation that the Southern Historical Society, founded by Confederate veterans, laid out was that if there had been some sort of hypothetical fair fight between the North and the South, the Confederates would have inevitably won. So that was a major accomplishment to sort of lay out that argument. Well, that argument was embraced and really broadcast regionally when the United Confederate Veterans was founded in 1889. And so I've included a photograph here of one camp, as they were called, one local camp of the United Confederate Veterans from a county in North Carolina in 1903. And these camps emerged, as I said, after 1889. And between 1889 and 1910, they proliferated. And probably at its peak, the United Confederate Veterans had as many as 50,000 members, roughly. So it was a truly regional organization then, committed to memorializing the Confederacy. So the last major group I want to talk about who played a crucial role, and in some ways perhaps the most important role even, in the commemoration of the Confederacy, were white Southern women. I mentioned earlier how acute was the need for affirmation from Confederate veterans like these we see in this photograph. These are men who wanted, as I said, to have their worth affirmed. And so, obviously, women had an important role to play in reaffirming, if you will, the worth of Confederate veterans. Partially, that was rooted in Victorian ideas of mourning, which assigned to women especially prominent roles in remembrance. So after Appomattox, white women, understandably, given the scale of the Confederate dead and wounded, etc., began organizing themselves into groups or taking pre-existing groups and repurposing them to address the needs of the Confederate dead and the Confederate wounded. One of the first tasks undertaken by these white women of the South was to create Confederate cemeteries and rituals of remembrance. The pathos, the grief of women in the South gave birth to Confederate Memorial Day, which allegedly originated in Columbus, Georgia in 1866, although folks in Romney, West Virginia also claim to have originated it. And so starting in 1866 in a few locations and then spreading across the South, once a year, Southern white women would decorate the graves of Confederate dead. It had broad appeal, and by the early 1870s, these local memorial observances had become a region-wide holiday. And by the early 20th century, Confederate Memorial Day was one of the most important public events in many Southern communities. So you'll see here a picture from the mid-20th century of women dressed in antebellum dresses and decorating Confederate graves in Columbus, Mississippi. When white women like these participated in the memorialization of Confederate dead, they were expanding the boundaries of women's cultural authority, as well as how they could act in public. As I'm sure you know, in the antebellum period before the Civil War, women's mourning customs had narrowly confined women. It dictated the most minute details of their dress and how they conducted themselves. But because the scale of loss in the Civil War was so great, and there were so many women who were mourning so many men, white women in the South necessarily revised the kind of restrictive customs that had dictated how mourning was observed. And so they created events like Confederate Memorial Day, but they also created involuntary associations which began to perform tasks that state or local governments couldn't perform because they didn't have the resources, or perhaps chose not to perform. So perhaps the most conspicuous example of this was what to do with Confederate dead who were scattered around away from their home. In other words, how to move the bodies of dead Confederates from where they were buried to their homes. And white Southern women created organizations that engaged in a truly gruesome activity. They would hire people to dig up the bodies of the Confederate dead in Gettysburg, Maryland, wherever it might be, and then ship them back to local communities, where then these Confederates were reburied in cemeteries like Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, or Oakwood Cemetery in Raleigh, North Carolina, or many other cemeteries created across the South. And this activity of digging up and reinterring tens of thousands of Confederate dead occupied these women's organizations for much of the late 1860s and especially the 1870s. But now we're finally getting to the form of commemoration you're probably most associate with the Confederacy. And that's the building of monuments to Confederate heroes across the South. And that's a cause that women, white Southern women, began to really take up in the late 1880s, but especially the 1890s and after. Part of this effort was tied to the increased organized might and political influence of white women. As the South regained its sort of equilibrium after the Civil War, women's organizations began to mushroom just like men's organizations. They had greater capacity to raise funds. And so across the late 19th century, women's efforts to erect monuments became more and more ambitious. Immediately after the war, women's groups often aided by men as well, by men's organizations as well, began erecting monuments in cemeteries. And here are two very early examples. The one on the left is from Romney, West Virginia, which is apparently one of the very earliest, from 1867. It's in a cemetery, and you'll see it looks like it's the aesthetics, the art is derived from funereal art. And on the right, you'll see a monument from Cumberland County, North Carolina. It was erected in 1868 in a cemetery. And it also uses a cross and looks like cemetery art, a cemetery monument. But as we move later and later into the 19th century, women's monuments, or the monuments that women chose to erect, began to migrate from cemeteries into conspicuous civic spaces. I'm going to use a lot of examples from North Carolina here because I happen to have done work on North Carolina because it's convenient to where I live. And there's nothing unique or idiosyncratic about North Carolina. The specifics may vary state to state, but what you see here is a trend that was characteristic of the South as a whole. You'll see the early monuments on the left hand are mainly erected in cemeteries. And then when you get close to the dawn of the 20th century, you'll see more and more monuments are erected in public space until they're almost exclusively being erected in public space.
And does that trend imply too that they're being erected with private funding?
Good question. They are being erected by private funding. Southern state governments were very parsimonious with everything, but especially with building monuments. Typically, Southern state governments would only fund the monuments that were erected around the state capitol, and sometimes then they would fund them. But otherwise, most of the monuments we see commemorating the Confederacy were essentially privately donated to public space. So they're a private-public partnership with almost all of the fundraising coming from women's organizations, especially the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which was founded in the 1890s.
Thank you. And Amelia, as a follow-up, Amelia asks, is there any correlation in the change around the turn of the century with veterans dying, with the aging of the Confederate veterans?
Excellent point. Yes, in two ways. One, you're absolutely right that there was a sense that this generation was dying off, so there was a need to commemorate them. But also, as the veterans, the peak of the United Confederate Veterans kind of cultural influence was really the 1890s. But already by 1900, because veterans were dying off, the United Daughters of the Confederacy began to assume the crucial role in the commemoration. So in a sense, it's both men dying off and the women assuming the leadership. And a further point about this is we should never underestimate the skill at fundraising of these women's organizations. Just one example, in Richmond, there for decades, there was an effort to create a monument for Jefferson Davis in Richmond. And during the 1890s, the United Confederate Veterans tried to raise money, and they did terribly. They just could not raise nearly enough money. So they finally surrendered it, that is, surrendered the campaign to the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the late 1890s. And within 7 years, the United Daughters of the Confederacy had raised the money and erected the monument. So it is both a combination, yes, of the sense that we need to recognize these veterans while they're still alive, but also women with this incredible ambition and skill taking over the cause. And speaking of that, just as an example here, again, I'm using Confederate monuments. These are just a sampling of the monuments that were erected, often in front of courthouses. The one in the center is actually a monument that used to be in front of the old courthouse, and then when they built this new courthouse in the 1990s, they moved the monument to in front of the new courthouse. But these are examples of these very impressive monuments in small North Carolina towns or cities. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with pictures of Monument Avenue in Richmond, or the monuments in Montgomery and other major Southern capitals, where those monuments are quite impressive. Or, of course, the largest bas-relief carving in the world, Stone Mountain in Georgia, which I realize this image is somewhat pixelated, but that is a truly momentous, monumental monument. So during between 1890 and 1920, white Southern women presided over the consolidation of Confederate commemoration and the Confederate landscape. So now I want to sort of pivot here quickly and turn to something you may be wondering about. So far, I have said nothing whatsoever about the propagation of white supremacy, the linkage between these Confederate memorials, and the politics of white rule in the South. And partially that's because the link was always present, but it was very seldom written into these monuments. Instead, it was so innate that it often went unexpressed. It didn't need to be expressed. So Dabney and those clerics I mentioned before, they defended the morality of slavery. They offered biblical justifications for white supremacy. So there wasn't really a need to write that on a monument. The lost cause historians, the folks associated with the Southern Historical Society that I mentioned, they dismissed that the Civil War had anything to do with slavery and argued instead it was just an illegitimate act of Northern aggression. So there wasn't usually any need to incorporate into the monuments something as obvious to white Southerners as African American inferiority or the urgency of maintaining white supremacy. Instead, that kind of work typically was done in dedication speeches that accompanied the unveiling of the monuments. That's where the racial ideology could be expressed most fully. And so the dedication speeches, in short, for many of these Confederate monuments offer our clearest expression of what the creators of the monuments hoped that the monuments would convey to future generations. So I'm going to use 3 monuments as examples and just try to give you some sense of what the dedication speeches included. So the first, again, these are North Carolina examples because I know them best, but you could find other examples virtually any state of the former Confederacy. So in 1913, the Confederate memorial that you see from this old historic postcard was erected on the campus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And when it was erected, the leaders of the university said that the statue that you see before you was, quote, not merely a monument to the dead, but also a lesson to the living. The person who gave one of the dedication, or a person who gave one of the dedication speeches, was Julian Carr, who's standing there in the center of that photograph at the Gettysburg 1913 50th anniversary reunion. Julian Carr was a very wealthy industrialist and an enthusiastic Confederate veteran. When he gave his dedication speech, he explained the relationship between the monument in 1913 and the Civil War and North Carolina's racial politics. He noted that the monument honored not only the alumni of the university who had died for the Confederacy, but also veterans who fought on after the South's defeat to reestablish government by and for whites only. And I quote him, Those men saved the very life of the Anglo-Saxon race. Praise God. He went on in his dedication speech in 1913 to recount his own efforts to enforce white supremacy. And here's the dedication of the monument in 1913. He said, quote, 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days after my return from Appomattox, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds, because on the streets of this quiet village she had publicly insulted and maligned a white Southern lady. For Carr, the statues celebrated, quote, courage and steadfastness in fulfilling the duties of white manhood, just as he had done after Appomattox. Now let me use another monument. This monument you see before you in Oxford, North Carolina. It was dedicated by William Kitchen, who was governor, you see him on the right, in 1909. He openly acknowledged white supremacy and the violence that accompanied it as simple facts of nature. We have seen the white man come in contact with the brown man of the tropics, and the brown man went down. We have seen him knock at the gates of the yellow man in the east, and they opened at his will. We have seen him face the black man in his native African home, and the black man gave him the path. We have seen him press the red man, and the red man is disappearing from the face of the earth. The white man's march has sometimes been cruel, but his right to rule was irrefutable. Kitchen believed that Confederate veterans understood this truth better than others. When he dedicated the monument, he spoke to veterans there at the dedication and praised their wisdom. Quote, you see what the whole country is beginning to recognize, that it's not in the power of all the armies ever drilled or of all the constitutions ever written to make the white and black races equal. The last example I want to use of a dedication speech is the dedication speech for this monument in Anson County, North Carolina, dedicated in 1906. A University of North Carolina alumnus and Confederate veteran named John McLaughlin gave the speech. And he told the audience, quote, our Anglo-Saxon ancestors wrested this land from the savages, built its home, its schools, and colleges. He recalled that after the Civil War, he and fellow veterans refused to surrender that inheritance, quote, to an inferior and numerous race of former slaves. They took up, he said, with, quote, grim determination, the heroic task of redeeming their state and committing their destinies into the hands of her white native citizens. So Confederate monuments, he concluded in 1906, stood, quote, as emblems to teach future generations lessons of fidelity to the principles and culture which are heritage of the white Southern people and the pride of every true son and daughter of the South. So I've lingered on these dedication speeches because, as I've said, they clearly intended the monuments, the message, to celebrate, I should say, not only Confederate valor, but to celebrate the cause of white supremacy for which Confederates had fought and which many white Southerners vowed to fight for generations to come. So this gets us to the 1920s. And before I take just a few minutes and then turn it over to Kevin, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about counter narratives in the South and then about the contemporary landscape. But I wanted to see if there are any questions. Andy, anything I should tackle?
There's been a lot of good conversation. And Kevin has done a great job of continuing the conversation.
All right. Well, let me carry on so Kevin can have the baton here. All right. I just want to quickly make a few points about counter memories. One of the reasons why Southerners at the turn of the 20th century were so anxious, that is, white Southerners, to commemorate the Confederacy, wasn't just that Confederate veterans were dying off, and white Southern women had a cultural ambition to create this Confederate landscape, I want you to keep in mind that they thought they were in a kind of commemorative arms race with the North. And they believed they were falling behind. Yankees were erecting monuments to the Union cause with as much urgency as white Southerners were. And I just have used these examples from Washington, D.C. Those of you who have been to Washington, D.C. may not have really thought about it, but it is a huge open-air commemorative landscape to the Union cause. There are 17 major monuments, and I've just picked, I don't know how many I have here, 8 or 9 of the 17. And if you've ridden the metro and you've gotten off at Farragut North, you probably didn't say to yourself, oh, that Farragut North Square is named after, of course, David Farragut, the Union admiral, et cetera, et cetera. He's up in the upper left-hand corner. So Washington, D.C., right across the river from Virginia and the former Confederacy, is this gigantic museum to the Union cause. So white Southerners were very conscious of the fact that they were trying to combat, if they will, this expanding Union commemorative landscape. But they were also aware that they faced challenges from African Americans in the South, who had a different historical narrative. Now, African Americans in the South obviously didn't have the resources to compete against this Confederate commemorative surge in the late 19th century. And of course, they didn't have the power that white Southerners had over the cultural landscape. So what black Southerners did was they created a calendar of commemorative rituals instead of commemorative monuments. One example is Emancipation Day. This is a wonderful photograph, which some of you may have seen in the new National Museum of African American Culture and History on the mall and associated with the Smithsonian. They have a gigantic version of this photograph. In any case, Emancipation Day was a holiday that took place on various days across the South, typically January 1st, in a few places in April. And of course, in Texas, it's called Juneteenth. But Emancipation Day was an opportunity for African Americans to, of course, celebrate the most consequential outcome of the Civil War and the defeat of the Confederacy, namely African American emancipation. But African Americans also turned Independence Day into a region-wide celebration. White Southerners during the late 19th century were not celebrating the 4th of July, but African Americans adopted the day as a day to celebrate equality and freedom. And African Americans in the South also celebrated National Memorial Day, not Confederate Memorial Day, but National Memorial Day, and celebrated, of course, the Union victory as part of that. So these celebrations provided a way for African Americans to demonstrate to themselves and whites that they had a different understanding of the meaning of the Civil War and of history. And it also provided an opportunity for them to celebrate African American veterans of the Civil War. I'll get to this in a moment, but white Southerners were not about to erect monuments to African Americans who had fought in the Civil War. And so they were literally absent from the landscape of commemoration that white Southerners were creating. But African Americans could incorporate Civil War veterans, Black Civil War veterans, into their ceremonies. I don't have any picture of Union veterans marching in the South, but I've got this picture demonstrating the events or comparable events in New York City on the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg. So there's 1 or 2 or 3, in fact, there are about 9 exceptions to what I just said about monuments. In a few places in the South, or in the former Confederacy, there are monuments to Union, quote, colored soldiers. There are 2 in cemeteries in Norfolk, Virginia. There's 1 here in Hertford, North Carolina, and then there are a couple in Kentucky, which wasn't part of the Confederacy. But these monuments are truly extraordinary because these are moments where African Americans created a monument that was in direct conversation, if you will, or directly contested the monuments that whites were putting up almost simultaneously. This monument to Union-colored soldiers in Hertford, North Carolina, is one of, as I said, fewer than a dozen monuments erected in the South. We know almost nothing about who erected the monument. It was a group of colored women, African-American women in Hertford, North Carolina. We know roughly when they were put it up, but otherwise it's almost a mystery because whites, as you could imagine, were not too keen to acknowledge this kind of counter memory. All right, so quickly, let me wrap up by talking about the contemporary landscape. And here I'm going to use North Carolina because we have a good inventory of the monuments in North Carolina. So, few points here. This is the number of monuments erected by decade in North Carolina to the Confederacy. Pardon me. Yes, these are not to the Confederacy. These are monuments in North Carolina to the Civil War and anything else. What you'll notice is how many monuments were erected between roughly 1900 and 1930. But what you might not be aware of is the kind of commemorative boom that we've been in since 1980. So if you notice, the second most monument or total number of monuments were erected in the 2000s after 1920, the decade of the 1920s in North Carolina. So we're in another kind of commemorative moment right now. And that's important for you to keep in mind as we move through this kind of discussion that I'm going to get to. So when we think about this commemorative impulse, it's not just a commemorative impulse to erect monuments like those that I was just talking about. It's also etched on the landscape with Confederate place names, street names, etc. I'm sure you know there are many Southern locales, as well as outside the South, where there are thoroughfares, streets named after Martin Luther King. But we've had much less of a discussion about all of the street names after Confederates. Let me just use this example of a subdevelopment built in Wilmington, North Carolina during the 1950s and early 1960s. And it may be hard for you to read these names, but if you look at these street names, this goes from Long Street all the way down here to Honeycutt. This is Jeb Stuart Drive here, Robert E. Lee Drive. All of these street names are after Confederate generals, some of them famous, some of them fairly obscure. I think it's hardly coincidence that this white suburb was created, built, erected during the 1950s, early 1960s, and the streets were named after Confederates right when the civil rights movement was making its presence felt in Wilmington, North Carolina. And then there are high schools. This is a notorious example of Nathan Bedford Forrest High School in Jacksonville, Florida. It got its name, Nathan Bedford Forrest High School, in 1966. I won't regale with you with the long story of how this school got its name, except to let you know that its predecessors, or parts of it, its predecessors were called Jeb Stuart, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Jefferson Davis School. And there was a lot of contention over naming the school between 1959 and 1966 after Nathan Bedford Forrest. The contention was not that it was inappropriate to name it after Nathan Bedford Forrest, but over which Confederate general the school would be named after. So, here are monuments commemorating wars in North Carolina. I'm coming back to monuments. At the bottom, you'll see we have counted 928 monuments in North Carolina to date. If you subtract all of these monuments that are listed here from the 928, you'll see that North Carolinians, like most America, or I'd say like most states in the nation, commemorate overwhelmingly wars. So something like 85 to 90% of the monuments in the state commemorate war. Since the Vietnam War, these monuments have been racially inclusive. And even some of these monuments since the Vietnam War acknowledge the participation of women in the conflicts. But again, if you subtract this, all of these monuments from the 928, you'll see that in North Carolina, only a tiny portion of the commemorative landscape addresses any human endeavors other than war. So, if we're going to have a more diverse landscape in North Carolina, and I suspect in most of America, there are only two ways to go about it as I see it. One is to fight a lot more wars and then erect monuments that are much more inclusive than those from before the Vietnam War. Or else we're going to have to erect monuments that represent something more than just war. And here are examples in North Carolina. By our count, there are 34 monuments in North Carolina of that 928 that acknowledge African Americans as historical actors. There are 25 that acknowledge women as historical actors. 21 American Indians. There are 10 monuments that honor animals. And it's not clear what, there's one, it's a hippopotamus. I don't know really what historical action the hippopotamus was in, but, and then I have here, these are the largest dresser, the largest chair, and this wonderful coffee pot in Old Salem. So my point is that the landscape that exists in North Carolina is dominated by monuments to war and especially monuments to the Civil War. And my final point about this landscape is these are some of the examples of Confederate monuments that have been erected since 2000. There have been almost as many new monuments to the Confederacy erected since 2000 as there are monuments in the entire state that acknowledge the historical contributions of women. So when we talk about creating a more diverse landscape, we've got a very, very, very long way to go in North Carolina. So, Kevin, let me turn it over, and thank you all for your patience.
Yeah, Fitz, thank you so much. And I do want to, I mean, first of all, I think the hippopotami lobby group must be pretty strong in North Carolina. But I wonder, you know, as you describe this, if you look at the monuments on the screen right now, and you think about the ways that this might have come back, what, in your view, is it a matter of diversifying the monuments, therefore making Civil War monuments more proportional? Is that sort of the answer, or is it sort of removing and replacing?
Well, that's a great, I think that's a good question for the conversation. I am one who thinks that there are certainly some monuments that are, I think it's entirely appropriate to move some monuments. There are some monuments which, frankly, there are Confederate monuments that are comparatively obscure. They're located in places where, to be honest, I can't imagine the communities have more pressing issues to address sometimes than some of these obscure monuments. So I think, I guess I'd put it this way. I advocate a kind of commemorative triage, which is we identify those monuments that we believe merit the quickest, most immediate, and most careful consideration of what to do with them. And then we work our way down to some of the other monuments which we may just choose to tolerate because it's not worth the money and effort to move them.
Fantastic. Fitz, thank you so much. And you're right. I'm now going to invite Kevin to join the conversation. Kevin, give me a moment to unmute you. And for the remaining, hey, Kevin, how are you?
Hi, everyone.
First of all, I appreciate you being so active in the chat box. And I do, you know, I very much want to invite you now to make comment on not only taking this sort of scholarly and very thoughtful and intellectual approach, but considering ways to have this conversation with younger students and the kinds of experiential work that you've done as well. So, Kevin, I've given you the mouse, and I'm going to invite you to go ahead.
Great. So I got control now, Andy. Thanks. Hi, everyone, again. So it's great to be here. I'm going to talk fast and try to get through everything that I want to get through. But just so you have a sense of my background, I've been in Boston for about 5-6 years now. Before that, I lived and taught in Charlottesville, Virginia. And as someone who's interested in the Civil War, specifically memory of the Civil War and monuments, I mean, you really can't think of a better place, or I can't think of a better place to teach. And the monument landscape in places like Charlottesville and even Richmond, those were my classrooms, as in the last couple years was the case here in Boston. Places like the Boston Common and other locations in and around the city where there's a Civil War presence. Most people think of Boston as sort of focused on the Revolution, but there's a very rich Civil War commemorative landscape within the city where I am and just outside. But so I use these monuments on a regular basis, but over the last 2 years, I've been traveling around the country working with students and teachers, going to schools, working online, and trying to figure out ways that we can, or how we can introduce this subject in the classroom. And it seems to me, you know, this is our moment as history educators. We are constantly being sort of asked to justify our discipline. And it seems to me this very public and divisive debate about monuments is tailor-made for us. There's really no one else who is equipped to do this. And it's important work because I think what it does is it allows us to sort of bring the conversation from the classroom, or focus students from thinking of history as something something you learn in a textbook or in class, and begin to focus them in the direction of the community. That history is all around us, and that this is important. How we as members of a community choose to remember our collective past is an important one, and we've taken it seriously in the past. We're certainly doing that right now over the last few years, especially since the horrific murders in Charleston in the early summer of 2015. So I think we should be addressing these issues with our students and finding ways to make them, to bring them into the conversation. One other thing I want to really stress here is that you can go onto YouTube and find video of city council meetings. You can find video of other kinds of social gatherings around this issue. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Richmond or Charlottesville or New Orleans. What you won't find are students. You won't find high school students, even younger, getting involved in the conversation. Now, why is this important to me? I think it's important because our students today, I mean, we're constantly knocking them for what they don't know, but at their best, our students, I think, have the most sophisticated understanding of American history of any generation. And I think especially when it comes to the Civil War, there are questions, there are subjects. Just think of the issue of slavery, emancipation, where you don't have to go back that far to find that those topics were either not taught or they were taught in a way that was inaccurate. The history even mythologized to a certain extent. So the decisions that are being made today in city council meetings and across the former Confederacy and beyond, these are decisions that are going to impact our students moving forward, right? These are decisions that they will have to live with, and it seems to me that they should have a stake in getting involved and helping to shape the commemorative landscapes of their neighborhoods. Now, in saying that, I think there are some concerns, right? When in the wake of Charlottesville this past summer, a lot of the schools that I worked with, their biggest concern was what happens when these arguments or discussions get heated, but even more importantly, what happens when these discussions get beyond the classroom. They can be highly politicized. Of course, the president himself chose to get involved in the Charlottesville incident. And obviously, we all know that once these discussions leave our classroom, we are not in control of them. And you may have to be prepared to respond to a concerned parent who has heard something from either his child or from somewhere else. So depending on where you are, you may want to inform your department chair or an administrator that you are discussing this issue, right? You want to cover yourself and be very clear about the goals for whatever it is you're trying to accomplish in the classroom. I think politics is really unavoidable in this. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is make sure that you are comfortable with this history. This is not easy history. I think, as Professor Brundage noted, you know, you're not really, if you're taking the monument debate or the history of monuments, you're not so much going back to the Civil War as you are going to that very messy and divisive period that we call Jim Crow. And that's a very difficult history to teach. So make sure you are comfortable with it, especially if you do get some pushback. So moving forward, so there are a couple things that I've tried to do in the classroom or have done in the classroom and have worked with other schools around the country on. And I'm just going to give you a taste. I'm not even going to go into detail into each of them, but you can find me online easily on Twitter and through my website, and I'm happy to sort of you know, talk with you further about any of these ideas. The easiest thing to do, and all of us have monuments in our communities, and one way to focus students on how their own community has chosen at different points in the past to commemorate history or some aspect of history is to have students research a local monument. Some of this information, you know, can be found online. Even better if you have a library that has a research facility, or if you have a local historical society. Any way to get students sort of beyond the classroom, actually looking at primary sources, real documents, is always a bonus. You can often find dedication speeches. You can often find information about the planning of a local monument, who was involved, what the goal of the monument, what its original intention was. All of these kinds of questions can help us move beyond thinking about history to thinking about how we choose to remember, right? That crucial distinction between history and memory. So just researching a local monument, whether it's a Confederate monument or marker or not, can at least begin to sort of get our students to think beyond sort of history as something you absorb, rather than also as something that matters to the community, that helps to shape who we take ourselves to be, what values we claim to embrace as members of a community. So one way, you know, to sort of also focus our students, and you know, if many of you probably live in communities that don't have a Civil War monument, one of the things that I used to love to do, or still do with students, is to ask them to imagine a new monument to their local landscape, especially in cases where, you know, it would be the first one. And what's interesting about this, of course, is, and this gets back to an earlier point, which is that, again, our students, their understanding of the Civil War is very different than our parents and especially our grandparents. So how they choose to remember or commemorate the war based on what they're learning in your classroom, giving them the opportunity to sort of shape their local landscape, can be a very meaningful activity. I've had students who are, you know, much better at you know, using clay than I am and other materials, fashion monuments. Some students feel more comfortable drawing monuments. Quite often what I'll do is I'll have students work in small groups to have to sort of listen to one another, especially in classrooms where you have an ethnically, racially diverse student body, getting them to sort of work together, listen to one another about what things they would like to see, what an inscription should read or what it should say. Always important, I think, to put students in a situation where they have to listen to one another. And this is a great example of adding a monument to a blank landscape. Professor Brundage noted the many Civil War monuments in DC, but this one is the first to actually commemorate the Black United States soldiers, USCTs, in DC. And this is a very recent addition to the commemorative landscape of DC. So the other approach that you can take, especially if you live in a community where you already have a Confederate monument or a Civil War monument or live near one, is think about ways to add to the commemorative landscape. So Charlottesville is a really interesting example right now because, as many of you know, there's a big question about whether or not the Lee and Jackson monuments will be removed. Today, a judge ordered that 2 tarps covering the monuments must be removed, and I think that was already done earlier today. But I think Charlottesville is going to be in a position where it's going to have to figure out how to enrich an already existing commemorative landscape that includes a monument to Lee on horseback and Jackson, both equestrian monuments. And that can be interesting for students to think about. And I think this is a great example of how that works. So think of the Wall Street District. Think of that iconic bull monument or statue that sort of signifies or symbolizes that vibrant American economy. And then just a few short months ago, as many of you know, the so-called fearless girl was added right next to the monument. And think about the way in which this completely transforms this little landscape, right? It now becomes a scene of sort of, feminist pride, if you will, right? This little girl standing up to the charging bull. I can do anything. The sculptor of that bull is furious about the ways in which his creation has been transformed, not in the way that he imagined or even approves. So how could the residents or students in Charlottesville think about this? I worked with a group of students there, and one student had the idea of perhaps placing a black Union soldier with weapon drawn right in front of Robert E. Lee, right? So, there are different creative ways in which we can engage our students on how to add to an already existing and perhaps controversial commemorative landscape. And Charlottesville and other places are examples of this. I should point out that even with all the monuments and statues that have come down over the last couple of years, the vast majority will likely remain. And those communities are going to have to figure out ways to sort of move beyond, or what's the next step. So another great conversation starter, and this is one from North Carolina in Raleigh. This was placed after a Confederate Veterans reunion in 1929. I love this example because it asks students to think about ways in which monuments and markers can be appropriated and what is appropriate and not appropriate. And what's interesting about this one is if you read the last line or on the left, accepting the arbitrament of war, they preserved the Anglo-Saxon civilization of the South and became master builders in a reunited country. So this is apparently an example where that white supremacist theme is explicit. And if you notice, of course, on the right, you'll notice 9 names. Just for time's sake, some of you have already, of course, can figure this out. Those are the 9 victims of the Charleston shooting, the murders committed by Dylan Roof at the AME Church in Charleston. And I'll ask students, is this an appropriate form of vandalism? Does this add to the meaning? Does this add another layer of meaning to this monument, to this marker? And you're always going to have an interesting discussion around questions like this. You can also throw in examples from the former communist bloc. There's some wonderful examples of monuments to former Soviet soldiers that have been vandalized in a certain way. One well-known example is a collection of soldiers, and they've been turned into Western cartoon characters like Ronald McDonald and Wonder Woman, and it's really quite striking how that act sort of shapes those monuments. Okay, we're almost there. Asking students to add historical markers to monuments, right? These are examples of 2 that were proposed for Monument Avenue in Richmond that won't be used, I suspect, but asking students to think about, look, if our goal is to inform visitors to places like Monument Avenue, what information should be included in a historical marker? And it asks students to think about visual, it asks students to think about the economy of words, what's essential? and how should that be arranged? I've had students do wonderful examples of historical markers just using PowerPoint as a kind of framework where you can actually employ the text and the images. And then finally, you know, every state in the Union has 2 representatives in Statuary Hall. Some of them, of course, are Civil War related, most are not. Find out, have your students find out who is being memorialized from their state. Is it appropriate? Should Alexander Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, still be there from Georgia? But other examples abound, right? And if they believe that they should be changed, ask them to figure out who should be honored, right? And this, again, I think is a way of engaging students in this question of why monuments matter and how they can get involved in this national discussion. Okay, we're out of time. Take it away, Andy.
Well, Kevin, you know, one of the things that I noticed in the suggestions that you made in the vignettes that you shared is this notion of conversation and really engaging students in a deeper discussion about not just the historical landscape, but the very present tense ways in which we can commemorate the culture that we want to embrace.
That's right.
And you know, it's striking to me how important that really is, which then leads us to say, as difficult as this topic is, talking about it, embracing it, you know, being able to sort of thoughtfully address that is the key. And that's where I think the first part of our session tonight really makes it much more appropriate. The more you know, the more able you are to articulate the reasons why and the things that you do. And Kevin, I'll put up this last slide that you have of the various resources, and we'll make sure that the group gets this.
Yeah, there you go. I won't say anything more.
You know, we're almost out of time. I want to ask one last question though, and I'm going to put this to both Kevin and Fitz. I want to ask both of you if you have a comment here. One of the things I like most about our webinars is that we have teachers from all over the country. And all of them have a context for what we've talked about tonight, but not all of them have the sort of deeply personal first person in my backyard notion of living in Virginia or North Carolina or the Southeast. Tell me why this matters if I'm in another part of the country. Tell me why you know, having students really be thoughtful about what commemoration means, and in particular, lost cause commemoration. How does it impact who we are as a country more than a region or a state or a town in the American South?
I guess I'll just throw out just a quick idea, and that is, look, I think despite what others might say, I maintain that the Civil War is probably the most important moment in American history, the most important event in American history, and it's probably the one event that most Americans have some view of. They're still, they are in many cases still deeply engaged about some of the central issues. It's the event, I think, that in many ways we're struggling over in terms of how we think of ourselves as Americans, how inclusive we're going to be. What does it mean to be an American? And I think some of those questions, many of those questions, harken back to the very questions that Americans were fighting about during the Civil War and struggling with in the decades to follow. And I think we've inherited that discussion. And I think many of the issues that we are dealing with today, it seems to me, are an artifact of that. And we're not really going to solve them until we come to terms with that history.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And Fitz, I'm going to reframe that question just a little bit for you. Last August, I would imagine you received an awful lot of media calls and folks from around the country and asking for your opinions, your insights on what was happening in Charlottesville and with Confederate monuments in general. I know you published several, really thoughtful essays on the topic. From your experience, from a national audience, what was the most common question you received? What were people struggling the most to understand during that sort of boiling over point?
Well, it was all mediated by journalists. I will tell you the most interesting interviews I had were actually from European journalists. I was interviewed by a Polish journalist, a Swedish journalist, and a German journalist. And they had very different way of thinking about this because of their own experiences or their national experiences. And they have had to wrestle with questions like this, as you would imagine, especially in Poland and Germany, extensively. So those questions were quite interesting. I think what Kevin raised is that this is monuments are a fascinating way, an important way for us to think about how we want to view ourselves and how we want others to view us at this historical moment and in the past. And I think the most typical question I got was, should the monuments be taken down? And that's such a limiting question to a conversation like this. There are so many other answers, other possibilities, other than removing them, even though I myself advocate moving some of them. So I've just been struck by, in some ways, the way in which journalists have tried often to simplify this conversation that we should be having.
Yeah, and that brings up, as maybe a final point, it reminds me of what Kevin said a moment ago in terms of historians and history educators being the most prepared to explore those complexities that really aren't binary, and they're not reduced to a yes or no checkbox that sometimes we might want them to be in this larger national and media-driven conversation. I can't thank both of you enough for joining us. Thank you again, Professor Brundage. Thank you again, Kevin.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And again, I want to thank all of you for joining us for this provocative conversation. Please follow our social media feeds, in particular Twitter and Facebook, to see upcoming events and activities hosted by the National Humanities Center. Tonight, when I close the room, you'll receive a link that asks you to do an evaluation, and then after completing that, you will receive a certificate for your participation, and you can share this with your teaching portfolio or your administration. And this should arrive in your mailbox within the hour once I've closed it. The recordings of tonight's session and all of our other webinars will be online soon. My colleague Libby Taylor is back from maternity leave on Monday, thank goodness. And she'll make sure that that everything is up to date, and you can grab not only the PowerPoint associated with tonight's conversation, but a recording of this conversation and your chat. Please join us soon for our next webinar. Next week, we'll be working with Kathy Olmsted from University of California at Davis on the history of the CIA and the FBI. After that, we'll be working with Heather Thompson from the University of Michigan on incarceration in America. And after that, with Mike Fontaine from Cornell and Sky Shirley from Brookline High School in Boston, right next door to Kevin, on the ways in which we can better understand our own democracy through a study of Rome and the classics. Unfortunately, each of those sessions is sold out at this point, but if you're interested in any of them, please email me and I'll add you to the waiting list, as we always have a name who tend to who have to cancel at the last minute. We do have 3 webinars after that, however, that still have a few slots remaining. I would encourage you to go to our website and sign up for one of these 3, or all of these 3 actually. It's Russian fiction in the 21st century, the history of Cuba, and an understanding of how to use George Orwell's 1984. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight. Have a safe and a positive school day tomorrow, and we'll see you again next time with the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night.